Good morning. Thank you for joining us here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida for today's STS-133 pre-countdown status briefing for the STS-133 launch to the International Space Station. Joining me today is Jeff Spaulding, NASA Test Director.
Good morning.
And Kathy Winters, Shuttle Weather Officer.
Good morning.
We'll hear from our panelists and then take questions. Jeff?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And I'm here today to provide you some status on where we are on from yesterday. As you remember, we briefed a preliminary plan on some repairs we needed to do to try to get into our launch countdown today. The plan, as we knew it yesterday, was to vent down our tank and remove and replace some parts that we thought were faulty on an air-half coupling on our right-hand OMS maneuvering system pod, and then do some leak checks. And as we went through the day yesterday, we learned that there was some additional work that we needed to do. As sometimes when you get into the job, you get a little bit smarter, and we did, and there were some things that we, because those meetings were actually still going on when we were talking yesterday, there was quite a bit more work, it turned out, that we needed to do from a leak check perspective and some of the venting operations that need to be done. As a result of that, we're a little bit down on our timelines that we had briefed yesterday, and so the ability for us to get in and call the stations today for launch countdown is no longer available to us. So our plan today is to go ahead and continue the work that we need to do on the repair and then getting back into flight configuration on the OMS pod. And then right now we're going to target a call to stations for tomorrow, for Sunday at 1:30 in the afternoon, which would move our launch date out an additional day to Wednesday the 3rd. Some of the things that we learned as we went along yesterday that changed our plan, we found that there were we planned on venting down the tank, and as part of that operation there was some additional venting that had to be completed that required some configuration of valving that caused some that we needed to get in and actually remove a door and a panel and change the configuration on some of our valving. And so as a result of that and some additional leak checks that needed to be done, some intermediate ones and some intermediate pressurizations that we hadn't accounted for in our preliminary plans, that just essentially drove our timelines out. Thus far, we've vented down the tanks that we talked about yesterday, both the intermediate and the final ventings. We've removed the doors and have done all of the things that we needed to get into the repair. We did remove and replace our air half coupling and the ground half coupling that we talked about yesterday, the parts that were faulty on the tank, and we've done some initial leak checks on those and also some moisture samples, and all of those came back good at this point, the initial ones. I have with me sort of a representation. This is actually a propellant air half coupling, and but it is very similar to the helium one that we had to repair on the vehicle, to give sort of a representative size and shape to what it looks like. This front part here, or the head of it where the cage is, would represent the part that sticks out from the panel, the servicing panel itself, that represents the area in which we would hook up a ground side quick disconnect to it. There's a poppet inside of here that actually depresses when the two are mated, and the ground hand side would have a device that actually goes inside of there to be able to push that and depress it, and then allows the gases or fluids to transfer between it. As I mentioned, this is a propellant one and not the helium one, but again, they're very similar in function and in what they look like. I think we also have a couple of slides that we can go ahead and show you too, to give a sort of a representation of where they are on the vehicle and orient you to how that looks. This is the location of where the panel is, where the air half coupling is that we removed and replaced. It's on the very back of the OMS pod on the right-hand side, down towards the bottom, next to the nozzle area there. And I think we have a little closer one up on the next slide. And that gives a little bit better perspective, and you can see it's kind of up and underneath, so it is above the folks' heads that would have to work on that operation. Normally we would have access panels and those types of things that are not shown in this picture to give us plenty of ability to get in there and do that work. But that's where the panel's located, and on the next slide, that's the panel itself, and you can see some of the other air half couplings that are sticking out on there. On the lower left-hand side is where the one that we had to change out on the helium system, that was the one giving us the problems in our inability to finish the operations we needed to do to get into launch. And then we did also take the opportunity here overnight to remove and replace one that was leaking on our nitrogen side. It was on the upper right-hand side there, and we removed and replaced that air half coupling as well. So those operations are actually done. And let's see, is there another slide? That's sort of a schematic right there that shows you the air half coupling that I was showing you in my hand. And beneath the cage part, which is the top head, there's the poppet itself, there's a spring, there's 2 seals, and also a filter that's inside of there. And all of the interior of that poppet is removed. The cage and the exterior portions that you see there all stay in place on the vehicle. Those are not removed. But the interior part unscrews, and all those interior pieces come out, and those are the things that were removed and replaced overnight. So as I mentioned, that work's all done and behind us, and the preliminary leak checks look good. But we do still have some additional ones once we get up to flight pressure, which will give us further confidence that we got a good repair. Right now we're in the process of doing a pressurization. This is an initial pressurization of the tanks. It's called a cheat load. And as part of that, we will bring the pressure up and do some additional leak checks. This is something we hadn't accounted for yesterday when I was speaking with you, and that we talked about. They had discussions throughout the day and learned again that we needed to do this. Normally when we're in configuration to go do our final press to flight mass, we are at a higher pressure than we were as a result of this repair. Since we've ended the tanks all the way down to ambient, we had to come back in, and now we have to get them up to an intermediate pressure before we can go and pressurize again to our flight mass. So that's what we're doing this morning, and that just started, and will take several hours to get us into the early afternoon hours. At that point, we have a couple of lines that we need to reconnect, and then go ahead and we'll start the rest of our operation, which is the 16-hour portion of the pressurization to flight mass. And we'll get into that hopefully later this afternoon or early evening, and that'll take us through tomorrow morning and get us in a good shape to pick up the countdown tomorrow afternoon at 1:30, as I mentioned. So right now we look like we're on a good path to get there. We'll continue to track and monitor that work throughout the day and the night to make sure that we can get there, and we'll let folks know if there's any changes to that. As I mentioned, our call stations is tomorrow at 1:30. The earliest tanking time would be at 6:27 on Wednesday morning, as that would put us to a new T0 time on Wednesday of 3:47 in the afternoon for a window open, and then of course about 5 minutes after that at 3:52 would be our targeted T0 time. We do have both Flight Day 3 and 4 capabilities off and on every other day throughout the window, as we mentioned yesterday. Wednesday is a day that has both Flight Day 3 and 4 capability, which means instead of a 10-minute window, we have about 3 extra minutes of window in there for that. So that does give us a little bit more margin to get off the ground if we would need that on launch day. Right now, then, launching on Wednesday, we still have up through and including Sunday, so that gives us 5 days of attempts to get off the ground, and that would give us our normal 4 and 5 day capability that we like to preserve. That gives us the maximum chance to get off the ground on any of our launches. So that does still preserve that ability and gives us lots of flexibility and lots of margin to get off the ground. And with that, I think we're really confident. The team has done an excellent job overnight. It's been a lot of hard work. They've addressed all of the issues as they've occurred throughout the time. As you can imagine, there's a lot of work that goes into these types of things. And I think we've done a great job, and we're looking forward to getting into call to stations tomorrow. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Kathy?
Well, it does look like that we are going to be having a front come down into the southeastern U.S. on our new launch day. With that, and also an upper-level trough that's dipping down in Texas, we should pull in some moisture into Florida on that day, causing just some concern for a low cloud ceiling and also some isolated showers in the area. We are going with a 30% chance of KSC weather prohibiting launch due to that. Overall, it doesn't look like it's going to be any widespread phenomenon. It just seems that it could give us a chance of some kind of isolated showers or even possible ceiling in the area. Another thing we're watching is Tropical Storm Tomas, which is down in the Caribbean. If we go ahead and look at the satellite picture, you can see Tomas is going to be is marching towards west-northwest. You can see it down there, entering the area of the Lesser Antilles, and it's marching northwest and going to be heading into the Caribbean for the next 5 days. By launch day, we're expecting it. The Hurricane Center is forecasting Tomas to be Category 2 transitioning to 3 around that time period south of Hispaniola. So that will definitely be something we'll just keep an eye on. Of course, not an immediate threat to launch, but we'll watch it in case it's going to be an issue for the SRB recovery folks as they spend a couple more days recovering the SRBs after launch day. And go ahead and show you the forecast from the Hurricane Center tracking the storm off to the northwest. If we have that slide, there we go. And you can see that how it will be pushing into the Caribbean and moving just south of Hispaniola by the time we get to launch. And again, a Category 3 hurricane, it's expected to be by that time. It was almost a hurricane this morning on the latest update, so possibly in this next update that we'll see in an hour from the Hurricane Center may already be a hurricane. Going into our forecast for launch, looking at our tanking forecast, weather looks pretty good overall for tanking, just a little bit breezy. We're expecting a little bit windier conditions on Tuesday than we were when we were talking yesterday, so and even northeast winds, so it's kind of nice that we delayed one day in a way because crosswinds are actually starting to become a concern for Tuesday. But for Wednesday, the winds are going to be decreasing and just gusting up to 15 knots for tanking. Just a 5% chance of violating tanking constraints just in case we do happen to get an isolated thunderstorm form over the Gulf Stream, but unlikely to occur. Going into our launch forecast, we are, again, just concerned about low cloud ceilings and isolated showers in the area. Not a big chance for this, but we did go with a 30% chance of KSC weather prohibiting launch. And for SRB recovery, we're expecting some windy conditions Tuesday, so seas are going to be picking up out there, and so by launch day, we're still expecting 5 to 6 foot seas out in the SRB recovery area, but that's well within constraints. For Spaceflight Meteorology Group's forecast for our abort landing sites in the U.S., we are expecting very good conditions for both Edwards and Northrop, not expecting any concerns. And also for the TAL sites, weather looks very good on launch day as well. If we do happen to delay 24 hours, we start to have that front move down through Florida on this day. We're not expecting a lot of weather with this front, but there could be some isolated showers in the area, and also, again, a concern for low cloud ceilings. So with that, we do have that slight concern for showers and a 30% chance of KSC weather prohibiting launch. For the abort landing sites in the U.S., Spaceflight Meteorology Group is forecasting good weather again, and they are also forecasting good weather for all 3 TAL sites on day 2. If we happen to delay 48 hours, the front should move through Florida by this time. We do expect the winds to get kind of breezy behind the front. The direction isn't too bad for us, though, from 010. The launch wind constraints begin around 20. They range from 23 knots to 34 knots, depending on the direction. From that direction, we would get concerned if it starts gusting up around 23 to 24 knots. So with that, we do have a 20% chance of KSU weather prohibiting launch. And again, the abort landing sites are good on day 3. And the TAL sites are only concerned on day 3. Oh, actually, we have good TAL sites all 3 days on day 3 as well. So overall, weather is just have a little bit of a concern on launch day for showers and ceilings in the area. Overall, it's not going to be a washout, but we do have that 30% chance of KSC weather prohibiting launch due to those concerns.
Thank you, Kathy. We'll now take questions. When the microphone comes your way, please state your name, affiliation, and to whom you're addressing your question. I will start over in the corner with Bill.
Bill Harwood, CBS for Jeff. With the timeline as it's laid out right now, is it tight or have you got margin in there to get to Wednesday, or is there still a challenge out in front of you?
We still have margin in that timeline. We got several hours of margin, I believe, and so as a result of that, we feel pretty good about getting back into getting our ability to get back into count.
Chris.
Chris Gebhardt with NASASpaceflight.com. Do you have an estimated time for tank repress completion tomorrow morning?
We expect or hope that it would be done somewhere between 6 and 8 tomorrow morning is our goal at this point, to try to get to that.
Marcia?
Marcia Dunn, Associated Press, with 2 questions. Given that you have a Flight Day 4 opportunity for Wednesday, if you go to Wednesday, try to launch, would you definitely try for that Flight Day 4 rendezvous if you need to?
Yes. Yes, we would.
And is there any sense of, even slight sense of secondary relief that you didn't have to deal with the Election Day complications?
I wouldn't say that there's relief. Certainly, I think it gives us a little bit more breathing room for a lot of the folks and maybe some other opportunities. We always want to make it as uncomplicated as possible for our team and be able to get them home in between launches, which is what was our biggest concern, and get them the rest that they need so they can get back to work. So if that move helps that in any way, certainly that's a good thing.
Ken.
Oh, Ken Kramer, Spaceflight Magazine for Jeff, please. I'd like to know, this additional work you did, was this more invasive into the ohm spot than you initially envisioned? And what is the difference between this initial pressurization and the 16-hour repressurization, please?
The work itself was not more invasive. It was just more of the work that we needed to do. As I did mention yesterday, there were meetings still going on developing our plans. We had some initial plans in place as to what we thought was the scope of the work, and we hadn't fully, obviously, defined all of that at that particular point in time. We thought we had our arms around the big nuggets, but there were some substantial things that we still needed to do that were defined after our discussion yesterday. The additional pressurization that we're doing this morning was, as I mentioned, because the tanks were vented all the way down in order to do the repair. We weren't starting at a normal place where we would to get into that final 16-hour pressurization. So we have to get ourselves up to a point in time where we can get to the ability to press to that final 16-hour thing later this afternoon. So that's why it took us a little bit. There was more work involved from yesterday to today, and that was one of the things that came out actually probably while we were talking yesterday that we discovered.
Chris.
Chris Gephardt with NASASpaceflight.com for a question for Kathy. You mentioned the watching the sea states and the winds out at the SRB recovery zone. Is that I'm a little confused. Is that a result of Tomas or the frontal system that'll be moving through?
For launch day, it's not the storm. It's the gradient winds that occurred the day before, and that's what would cause the seas to be up a little bit, just 6 feet. I mean, they can certainly work in those conditions. Really, they start getting more concerned when we get over 8 feet out there, and then they start looking at the wave period and direction. And then if it's over 10 feet, they usually will just spot the SRBs and hold off.
Mark Kirkman, Interspace News for Jeff. Can you just clarify, since you already did the pressurization prior to the initial, what we thought was going to be called the stations, for this, you only depressurized the right ohms, helium, and nitrogen tanks, right? So those are the only two tanks that you have to repress today. Is that correct?
Well, yes, there's multiple tanks within the ohms pod, but yes, it's on the right-hand side. It's those tanks on the helium side and on the nitrogen side as well that we had to go back and repair, and as a result, depressurize.
And can you refresh me on? I think you're talking ultimately flight mass is close to like 4,000 psi. What the difference is between that initial level you start at and how you get up, what the final number is?
I don't know the actual difference between the two and where we end up finally on that. So we can get that data for you, though, certainly.
James.
James Dean with Florida Today. Jeff, hopefully you won't be getting down to that last attempt on the 7th, but that does still cost you a +1 day if you get there, right? Can you just talk about what that would do to your mission potentially to not have a +1 day? Is there any loss of work that you would do, or is it just something where if something came up you would deal with it mid-mission, or just what does it mean to not have that when you launch?
The +1 at this point is contingency only. All the work is still planned and defined within the other two EVAs that we have scheduled for this mission, and and of course we feel good about that. On orbit, things can happen and change. That's why we often like to protect for a contingency day downstream. But I'm certain that they'd be able to rework the schedules to get the maximum amount of things done on orbit.
Also, just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the crew's doing with this extra couple days that they'll spend here. I'm sure they're doing some more STAs and whatnot. What else is going on with the crew?
Normally, it's more additional training, just like you said, and they have more opportunity to do some of those things. Often there's a little bit more relaxation time in there as well. I don't have exactly how much time they have for that, but generally they do like to have some of that extra time too, just to review all of the different things that they need to for these flights and these missions. That's because they're so critical and there's so much that they often have to do, and it does give them some extra time to do that. So sometimes that does actually add some benefit to them as well.
Bill.
And just for the record, I'm assuming the strategy would be try 2, stand down, and then try 2 more.
That's exactly
right. So you
right.
got 4 attempts out of the rest of the window.
Right. We have our standard plan would be to do that 4 and 5 days, and then of course whatever happened along the way would dictate how that worked out.
Are there any further questions? Ken.
Hi, Ken Kramer for Spaceflight Magazine. For Kathy, is there any chance that hurricane is going to be coming up here if that if the launch does get delayed?
Well, the models, and I was looking pretty far out, and there was a northeast turn at the end of some of the models, not towards Florida so much, actually more off to the east So it's always a possibility. It'll depend on the timing of when that comes into the Caribbean and the timing of the trough, and if the trough puts more shear on it before it actually would make a move to the northeast. So it's something we'll watch. It's pretty far out right now. This far out, a lot of things can happen, and so we just monitor it, and as the time comes, we'll deal with it if we need to. And I'll watch it for the SRB recovery area for the 2 days following launch while they're still out there working.
Any further questions? That will conclude today's STS 133 pre-countdown briefing. Events and milestones for the countdown will be posted on our webpage at www.nasa.gov/shuttle. Just to recap, the launch for STS 133 to the International Space Station now is planned for Wednesday, November 3rd at 3:52 p.m. with a 1:30 call to stations tomorrow afternoon, which means the countdown clock would begin ticking down at 2 p.m. Please join us live on NASA television today at noon Eastern Time for the progress docking at the International Space Station, followed by a 2 p.m. launch health news conference here at Kennedy Space Center. Thank you.